Stanford professor called it impossible. Then an orphan boy raised his hand. The lecture hall fell silent as Professor Richard Maxwell's chalk screeched to a halt. His weathered hand trembled slightly against the blackboard, pausing mid-equation. For 30 years, he'd presented this same impossible problem to his advanced theoretical physics class at Stanford, and for 30 years, no one had solved it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wheeler-Maxwell Paradox, they called it. A theoretical boundary condition that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. Not even his colleagues at CERN had cracked it. But today, in the back row of the lecture hall, a thin arm rose hesitantly into the air. A boy no older than 16, with secondhand clothes and eyes that had seen too much, was about to change everything. They said it couldn't be done. For 3 decades, the Wheeler-Maxwell Paradox had remained unsolved, a theoretical puzzle that defied conventional physics. The problem, scrawled in fading chalk across the blackboard of Lecture Hall B in Stanford University's Varian physics building, had become Professor Richard Maxwell's signature challenge to each new class of doctoral candidates. It was his ritual, his way of humbling the brightest minds in theoretical physics. The clock ticked quietly as 63 students stared at the equation, pencils scratching, brows furrowed. Professor Maxwell paced slowly between the rows of desks, hands clasped behind his back, silver hair catching the afternoon light that streamed through tall windows. His tweed jacket bore the familiar chalk dust that had accumulated through years of passionate lectures. At 72, he still commanded the room with the quiet authority of a man who had devoted his life to understanding the universe's hidden language. 10 more minutes, he announced, his voice carrying the slight British accent that hadn't faded despite 40 years in California. Though I should warn you, this problem has resisted solution since I first proposed it in my 1993 paper. No one in this room is expected to solve it today. It was a tradition, almost a game. Maxwell would present the paradox, students would struggle valiantly, and he would eventually reveal why it remained unsolved, pointing out the fundamental incompatibility between quantum field theory and thermodynamic equilibrium that his equation exposed. It was a humbling lesson in the limits of current theoretical frameworks, designed to inspire a new generation to push those boundaries. Near the back of the lecture hall sat Elijah Foster, hunched over his notebook. Unlike the other students, graduate candidates dressed in Stanford hoodies and designer glasses, Elijah wore a faded blue button-up shirt, meticulously pressed but fraying at the collar. At 16, he was nearly a decade younger than anyone else in the room. His presence was the result of Stanford's Exceptional Minds program, which allowed a handful of gifted high school students to audit university courses. But Elijah wasn't supposed to be in this particular class. He had slipped in, drawn by Maxwell's reputation, fascinated by the theoretical framework of quantum mechanics that seemed to open doors to understanding the universe in ways that made sense to his unusual mind. Ways that helped quiet the chaos. Ms. Rivera, his caseworker at Horizon House Group Home, had encouraged his interest in physics, bringing him discarded textbooks and library loans. "Your brain works differently, Elijah," she often told him. "That's not a weakness, it's your strength." On days when the memories of his parents' accident became too heavy, when the other boys at the home made fun of his silence, his awkwardness, the equations became his sanctuary. Elijah's pencil moved rapidly across the page, not following the traditional approach the doctoral students were taking. Instead, he drew a series of concentric circles, a geometric visualization that would have puzzled any conventional physicist. Inside these circles, he wrote tiny, precise numbers, a notation system entirely his own. Professor Maxwell glanced toward the back row, noticing the young boy who shouldn't be there. He had seen him before, lurking in the hallways of the physics building, listening outside doorways of lectures. Another kid fascinated by the mystique of quantum physics, he had thought. Maxwell had meant to ask him to leave, but something in the boy's intense focus, the careful way he took notes, had stopped him. There was a hunger for understanding in those eyes that reminded Maxwell of himself at that age. 5 minutes, Maxwell called out, watching students shift nervously in their seats. Several had already put down their pencils, accepting defeat. Others were frantically erasing, starting over, desperate to be the first to crack the legendary problem. In the back row, Elijah's hand paused. He looked down at his notebook, at the strange circular pattern he had drawn. It was complete. The answer had emerged from his unconventional approach, not through the standard mathematical techniques taught in universities, but through a visual, geometric understanding that came naturally to him. The circles represented energy states in a way that bypassed the paradox entirely. He hesitated. Speaking up had never come easy. The foster homes, the schools, the counselors, they had taught him that standing out brought attention. And attention rarely led to anything good. But the answer burned in his mind. The solution was elegant, beautiful even. It deserved to exist in the world. Slowly, his thin arm rose into the air. Professor Maxwell didn't notice at first, still pacing between the front rows. A graduate student saw it, though, and smirked. "Looks like the kid visitor has a question," he whispered to his neighbor, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. A few chuckles rippled through the room. Maxwell turned, following the students' gazes to the back row. "Yes?" he said, his tone patient, but carrying the slight weariness of a man who had fielded thousands of misguided attempts at his paradox over the decades. Elijah's voice was soft, almost inaudible. "I think I might have found an approach." Maxwell smiled. "Kindly, would you like to come to the board?" It was a courtesy he extended to all students brave enough to attempt the impossible. A learning moment, even in failure. Elijah stood, clutching his notebook. The walk to the front of the lecture hall stretched like a mile. 63 pairs of eyes followed him, some curious, some dismissive, some pitying the young boy who didn't know enough to know what couldn't be done. At the blackboard, Elijah hesitated again, chalk in hand. Professor Maxwell stood aside, giving him space. "Take your time," he said gently, expecting a brief, flawed attempt that he would use. As a teaching moment, Elijah took a deep breath. Then his hand began to move. He didn't write equations, at least not conventional ones. Instead, he began drawing his concentric circles, precise and perfect, despite his trembling hand. Around these circles he added smaller notations, arrows indicating direction and flow. Only then did he begin to add the mathematical expressions, strange hybrid formulas that seemed to merge aspects of topology with quantum field theory in ways that violated conventional approaches. The room fell completely silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers ceased. Maxwell stood transfixed, his eyes following every stroke of chalk. His expression shifted from patient kindness to confusion, then to intense concentration as he struggled to follow the unorthodox methodology. Unfolding before him, Elijah worked silently, filling the board with his circular diagrams and connecting equations. When he ran out of space on one board, he slid it upward and continued on the fresh surface below. The only sound was the soft scratch of chalk and the increasingly rapid breathing of Professor Maxwell beside him. 7 minutes later, Elijah placed the final symbol, a simple equal sign, followed by a solution that elegantly resolved the paradox. He stepped back, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room, and whispered, "The problem isn't with thermodynamics or quantum theory. It's with our assumption that energy states have to be represented linearly. If you map them as circular permutations, The paradox dissolves. Professor Maxwell stared at the board, unmoving. The silence in the room grew heavier, uncomfortable. Students exchanged glances, uncertain what they were witnessing. Was this a joke? Had the famous professor arranged this as some kind of elaborate demonstration? Slowly, Maxwell approached the board. His hand, lined with age and decades of academic battles, reached out to touch one of the circles Elijah had drawn. He traced it, following the equations that branched from it. His finger moved across the board, connecting concepts, testing the logic. His breathing quickened. "This isn't possible," he whispered, but there was wonder in his voice, not dismissal. He turned to look at Elijah, who stood with his eyes fixed on the floor, shoulders hunched, as if expecting ridicule or punishment. "Young man," Maxwell said, his voice unsteady, "where did you learn this approach?" Elijah shook his head slightly. "Nowhere, sir. I just see it this way. The energy doesn't flow in straight lines. It cycles, like water." His voice grew even quieter. "Like everything eventually comes back around." Maxwell turned back to the board, his mind racing through the implications. The approach was unlike anything in current literature. It didn't just solve the paradox. It opened doors to questions that had been deemed unanswerable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If energy states could be modeled this way, then the implications for quantum computing, for understanding black holes, for reconciling quantum mechanics with general relativity. "What's your name?" Maxwell asked. "Elijah Foster, sir. And you're not one of my students." It wasn't a question, but Elijah answered anyway. "No, sir. I'm from Horizon House. It's a group home for orphaned and displaced youth in East Palo Alto," Maxwell finished, surprising Elijah. "I serve on the board of a foundation that provides funding." His eyes narrowed, studying the boy with new interest. "How old are you, Elijah?" 16, sir." A murmur went through the lecture hall. 16 and solving what seasoned physicists couldn't approach. Professor Maxwell turned to the class, his face transformed by an expression few had ever seen. A pure, unbridled academic excitement. "Class dismissed," he announced. "Except for you, Mr. Liu. Would you fetch Dr. Hernandez and Dr. Choi from their offices? Tell them to come immediately." He turned back to Elijah. "And you, young man, are staying right here." As students gathered their things, the buzz of conversation filled the room. Most cast curious glances at the strange diagram that covered the board, taking photos with their phones before leaving. A few of the doctoral candidates approached, examining the work more closely, their expressions moving from skepticism to stunned respect. When the hall had emptied except for Elijah and Professor Maxwell, the old physicist pulled up a chair and sat directly in front of the boy. "Elijah," he said quietly, "do you understand what you've done today?" Elijah shifted uncomfortably. "Solve the problem?" Maxwell laughed, a sound of pure delight. "Yes, solve the problem, the unsolvable problem. The problem that has been the bane of theoretical physics for 30 years. He leaned forward. "But more importantly, you've approached it in a way no one has considered. This circular permutation method, it's revolutionary." Before Elijah could respond, the doors to the lecture hall burst open. Two professors hurried in, Dr. Sophia Hernandez, Chair of Applied Physics, and Dr. Min Choi, a quantum computing specialist. Both stopped short when they saw the blackboard. "Richard, what on earth?" Dr. Hernandez began, then fell silent as she took in the equations. Dr. Choi moved directly to the board, his eyes scanning the circular diagrams. "These transformations, they're beautiful," he whispered. "Who did this?" Maxwell gestured toward Elijah, who seemed to be trying to make himself invisible in his chair. "This young man just walked in and solved the Wheeler-Maxwell Paradox, and not by conventional means. The two professors turned to Elijah, who fidgeted under their scrutiny. "I need to get back," Elijah said softly. "Ms. Rivera will worry. I'm only supposed to be at the library until 5. Maxwell checked his watch. "It's only 3:30. We have time." He turned to his colleagues. "Sophia, Min, I believe we're witnessing something extraordinary here." Dr. Hernandez approached Elijah slowly, as one might approach a nervous animal. "Hello, Elijah. I'm Dr. Hernandez." Her voice was warm, with a slight Spanish accent. "Would you mind explaining your thinking to us? How did you arrive at this approach?" Elijah looked up, meeting her kind eyes briefly before looking away again. "The energy wants to return to where it started," he said. "Everything does. It's more natural to represent it as circles than lines. When my parents died, the social worker drew circles for me to explain how grief works. You don't move through it in a straight line. You cycle back through the same points, but each time the circle gets a little wider until you can contain it." He gestured to the board. "Energy does the same thing." The three professors exchanged glances, moved by both the insight and the glimpse into the boy's life. "And you developed this circular approach on your own?" Dr. Choi asked. "You haven't read this in journals or seen it in lectures?" Elijah shook his head. "I don't have access to journals. Just the books Ms. Rivera finds for me and what I can read at the library." He hesitated. "And sometimes I listen outside the lecture halls. I'm sorry about that." Maxwell waved away the apology. "Never apologize for seeking knowledge, young man." He stood up, pacing now, his mind clearly racing. "We need to talk about your future, Elijah. This kind of insight doesn't come along often in a generation, let alone in someone so young." "My future," Elijah repeated, confusion in his voice. "Yes, your future," Maxwell said firmly, "which, if I have anything to say about it, will not be limited by your current circumstances." He turned to his colleagues. "We need to arrange something, special enrollment, scholarship, mentorship, whatever it takes." Dr. Hernandez nodded. "The Emerging Scholars Initiative could be adapted. We've never had someone this young, but exceptions can be made." "What about his living situation?" Dr. Choi asked. "Group homes aren't exactly conducive to advanced theoretical work." "One step at a time," Maxwell said, turning back to Elijah, who was watching this exchange with growing alarm. "I can't leave Horizon House," Elijah said suddenly. "The younger kids, I help them with homework. And Ms. Rivera needs my help with the garden. I'm the only one who understands the watering schedule." The professors fell silent, struck by this glimpse into the boy's world. A brilliant mind that cared as much about watering schedules and helping younger children as it did about solving impossible physics problems. Maxwell sat down again, facing Elijah directly. "How about this? We start small. You come to my lectures, officially this time not listening from the hallway. We meet twice a week to discuss your ideas. We build from there, at a pace that works for you and respects your commitments at Horizon House." Elijah considered this. "You really think my solution works? It's not wrong." "It's not wrong," Maxwell said firmly. "In fact, I suspect it's more right than anything I've seen in 30 years of physics. And I want to understand how your mind works, how you see these patterns that the rest of us have missed." For the first time, Elijah fully met the professor's gaze. In Maxwell's eyes, he saw not the pity he was accustomed to, not the impatience of previous teachers frustrated by his different way of thinking. He saw recognition, respect. "Okay," he said quietly. Maxwell smiled, a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Excellent. We'll start tomorrow." He stood addressing his colleagues. "Sophia, Min, I'd like you both to review Elijah's work thoroughly. We need to verify everything, of course. but I suspect we're looking at a publishable breakthrough. As the professors huddled, discussing next steps and logistical details, Elijah remained in his chair, looking up at the blackboard covered in his circular diagrams. For years, he had drawn these patterns privately, a way of making sense of a world that often seemed chaotic and cruel. The circles helped him contain difficult truths, that parents could vanish in an instant, that homes were temporary, that he was different in ways that made others uncomfortable. He had never imagined that those same circles might help unravel the secrets of the universe, that his way of seeing, born from loss and necessity, might have value beyond his own survival. Professor Maxwell approached again, breaking into his thoughts. "You'll need a notebook, a proper one for our work together." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a leather-bound journal, well-worn but high quality. "This was my field. Notebook during my time at CERN. I think it should start a new chapter with you." Elijah took the notebook hesitantly, running his fingers over the smooth leather. "Thank you, sir." "Richard," Maxwell corrected. "When we're working together, you can call me Richard." He glanced at his watch. "Now let's get you back to Horizon House before Ms. Rivera worries. I'd like to speak with her as well, to explain what we're proposing." As they gathered their things to leave, Dr. Hernandez approached Elijah once more. "Before you go, I have one question," she said. "When did you first realize you had solved it? What was the key insight?" Elijah thought for a moment. "When I stopped trying to make it work the way everyone said it should," he answered simply. "The universe doesn't care about our rules. It has its own." Dr. Hernandez smiled. "Out of the mouths of babes," she murmured. The group left the lecture hall, but not before Professor Maxwell took one last look at the blackboard covered in circular diagrams. In 45 years of teaching, he had never instructed his classroom assistant to preserve the day's work overnight. Today, he left a note. "Do not erase these boards under any circumstances." Outside, the California afternoon sun bathed the sandstone buildings in golden light. As they walked across the quad, Maxwell placed a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've spent my career telling students what's impossible. Perhaps it's time I learned a new approach." Elijah didn't respond, but for the first time that day, he walked with his head up, eyes taking in the world around him, rather than fixed on the ground. The circles in his mind continued to spin, expanding outward, containing new possibilities that just hours ago had seemed as impossible as solving the Wheeler-Maxwell Paradox. In the 30 years since Richard Maxwell had first presented his famous paradox, he had come to believe that some problems were meant to remain unsolved, beautiful in their resistance to human understanding. But today, an orphaned boy with circles in his mind had shown him that impossibility was often just a failure of perspective. As they approached the faculty parking lot, Maxwell found himself wondering what other impossible things might suddenly become possible now that Elijah Foster had raised his hand. Horizon House stood on the edge of East Palo Alto. A weathered Victorian building painted a hopeful shade of yellow that had faded under years of California sun. The once grand home had been converted into a group facility for orphaned and displaced youth decades ago. Its large rooms divided to house as many children as regulations would allow. The wraparound porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the garden that surrounded the property showed signs of careful attention despite limited resources. Professor Richard Maxwell pulled his aging Volvo into the gravel driveway, casting a thoughtful glance at Elijah in the passenger seat. The boy had been silent for most of the 20-minute drive from Stanford, his fingers tracing the edges of the leather notebook in his lap. The contrast between the gleaming sandstone buildings of the university and this humble structure wasn't lost on either of them. "This is home?" Maxwell asked gently, breaking the silence. Elijah nodded. "For the past 4 years." Maxwell studied the building with new interest. "How many children live here?" 12 right now," Elijah said. "I'm the oldest. The youngest is Mia. She's 6. As they approached the front door, it swung open before they could knock. A woman in her early 50s, with warm brown skin and silver-streaked hair, pulled back into a practical bun, stood in the doorway. Carmen Rivera had the weathered look of someone who had witnessed both the best and worst of humanity, but had somehow maintained her faith in the former. "Elijah," she said, relief evident in her voice. "The library called when you didn't check in." Her eyes moved to Professor Maxwell, instantly assessing this unfamiliar presence. "And you are Professor Richard Maxwell, Stanford Physics Department," he replied, extending his hand. "I apologize for bringing Elijah back later than expected. We had quite a remarkable afternoon." Ms. Rivera's expression remained neutral as she shook his hand, but her eyes narrowed slightly. In 20 years of running Horizon House, she had developed a healthy skepticism toward authority figures who suddenly took interest in one of her kids. "Perhaps we could speak privately," Maxwell suggested. She nodded and turned to Elijah. "Dinner prep started 15 minutes ago. It's your turn to help Marco with the salad." Elijah glanced between Ms. Rivera and the professor. "Should I go on?" she said gently. "We'll talk after." As Elijah disappeared inside, Ms. Rivera led Professor Maxwell to a small office just off the main entryway. The room was crowded with filing cabinets and mismatched furniture, the desk piled high with paperwork and 3 different coffee mugs in various states of emptiness. A wall of photographs showed children of different ages and backgrounds. The extended family of Horizon House, past and present. "Please have a seat," she said, clearing a stack of files from a chair. "Now what's this about Elijah? He's not in any trouble, is he?" Maxwell settled into the chair, which creaked under his weight. "Quite the opposite, Ms. Rivera. Elijah has done something extraordinary today." He paused, considering how to explain the significance to someone outside the field of theoretical physics. "Are you familiar with my work?" She raised an eyebrow. "Should I be?" He smiled slightly. "No reason you would be. I specialize in quantum thermodynamics, the study of how energy behaves at the smallest scales of matter. For the past 30 years, I've been working on a theoretical problem that has resisted solution, something we call the Wheeler-Maxwell Paradox." "I see," she said, though her expression suggested she was waiting for the part that concerned Elijah. "Today, your Elijah walked into my advanced graduate seminar, sat in the back row, and solved it. Not just solved it. He approached it in a way that may fundamentally change how we understand certain aspects of physics." Ms. Rivera's professional composure slipped, her eyes widening. "Elijah did this? My Elijah?" "Your Elijah?" "Maxwell." "Confirmed. And I'd like to discuss the possibility of working with him directly, a special mentorship program leading eventually to early enrollment at Stanford." She leaned back in her chair, studying the professor. "Elijah has always been bright, different, the way he sees the world." She trailed off, then refocused. "But he's still a ward of the state. There are protocols, limitations to what I can approve." "I understand," Maxwell said, "but I want to be clear about what's at stake here. Elijah has a mind that comes along perhaps once in a generation. With the right guidance, he could make contributions to science that we can't even imagine yet." Ms. Rivera was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer but firm. "Professor Maxwell, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I need you to understand something. Every adult who walks through that door wanting something from one of my kids, they all believe their agenda is the most important thing in that child's life. Sometimes they're right, often they're not." Maxwell opened his mouth to protest, but she held up a hand. I'm not finished. Elijah isn't just a brilliant mind. He's a boy who has lost everything, who has struggled to connect with people, who still wakes up screaming some nights. His well-being, all of him, not just his intellect, that's what matters to me. The professor's expression softened. Ms. Rivera, I'm not here to exploit him. I want to nurture his gift, yes, but in a way that supports his whole person. That's why I came to you first, rather than going straight to the university administration or the state. She studied him for a long moment, then sighed. Elijah has been teaching himself physics from discarded textbooks for years. He fills notebooks with equations I can't begin to understand. If anyone deserves a chance like this, it's him. She leaned forward. But we do this on his terms, at his pace. And at the first sign that it's too much, we pull back. Agreed? Maxwell nodded. Agreed. Then let's talk to Elijah. They found him in the kitchen, methodically chopping carrots into perfectly even slices while a boy with a leg brace stirred a pot on the stove. The kitchen was well used but clean, with motivational posters and children's artwork covering most of the refrigerator. Elijah, Ms. Rivera said, Professor Maxwell and I would like to speak with you in the garden. The boy carefully placed the knife on the cutting board and wiped his hands on a towel. The other boy, Marco, looked up curiously but said nothing, as Elijah followed the adults outside. The garden behind Horizon House was surprisingly lush, with raised vegetable beds and flowering shrubs arranged in concentric circles around a central sitting area. Maxwell noticed that the planting pattern resembled, perhaps not coincidentally, the circular diagrams Elijah had drawn on the blackboard hours earlier. "Did you design this?" he asked, gesturing to the garden layout. Elijah nodded. It maximizes growing space while creating natural pathways. The innermost circle gets the most attention, so that's where we put the herbs and greens that need daily harvesting. The outer circles are for plants that need less maintenance. Maxwell exchanged a glance with Ms. Rivera. Even here, in something as seemingly unrelated as gardening, Elijah's unique perspective manifested itself. They sat on a weathered wooden bench, Elijah between the two adults. Ms. Rivera placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Professor Maxwell has proposed something special, Elijah. He wants to work with you, to mentor you in physics. Elijah looked down at his hands. Because of the paradox solution? Yes, Maxwell said, but more than that, your approach, the way you visualize these problems, it's extraordinary. I believe you have much more to offer. Insights that could advance our field significantly. What would I have to do? Elijah asked cautiously. To start, you'd meet with me twice a week after school. You'd have access to the physics library, to journals and resources you haven't had before. You'd attend certain lectures, officially this time. Maxwell smiled slightly. As things progress, we could discuss more formal arrangements, special enrollment perhaps. Elijah was quiet for a long moment. Would I have to leave Horizon House? Not immediately, no, Maxwell assured him. Any changes would happen gradually, and only with your agreement. Ms. Rivera squeezed Elijah's shoulder. This is your decision, Elijah. No pressure either way. The boy looked up at the garden, at the concentric circles of plants bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. When he spoke, his voice was soft but certain. I want to try, but I still need to help with the garden and with Mia's math homework. She struggles with fractions. Maxwell nodded solemnly. We can work around your commitments here. Your responsibilities to this community matter. Then yes, Elijah said. I'd like to learn more. Excellent, Maxwell smiled. We'll start tomorrow after your school day ends. I'll arrange for transportation. He stood, brushing off his tweed jacket. And Elijah, bring your notebooks, all of them. I'd like to see what else you've been working on." After the professor had gone, Ms. Rivera sat with Elijah a while longer in the garden. The sounds of dinner preparation drifted through the open kitchen windows. Marco calling for someone to set the table, younger children laughing as they raced through the house. "Are you sure about this, Elijah?" she asked. "It's okay to say no or to change your mind later." Elijah watched a hummingbird dart between the sage flowers. "When my parents died, everything stopped making sense. The world became random, chaotic." He gestured to the garden. "The circles helped. They contained things, gave them boundaries I could understand." His voice grew quieter. "The physics is the same. It helps me make sense of things that seem random. Professor Maxwell is the first person who's ever understood that." Ms. Rivera nodded, her eyes glistening slightly in the fading light. "Then I'm glad you found each other." She stood, smoothing her practical cotton slacks. "Come on, dinner's almost ready, and I believe it's your night for the bedtime story with the little ones." Elijah followed her inside, back to the rhythms of Horizon House that had structured his life for 4 years. But as he helped serve dinner, as he listened to Marco's jokes and mediated a dispute between 2 of the younger boys, as he read The Little Prince to Mia and the other children before bed, his mind kept returning to the leather notebook sitting on his desk upstairs, to the equations waiting to be explored, to the circles that connected everything. For the first time since his parents' car had skidded off a rain-slicked road 4 years ago, Elijah felt something new taking root alongside his grief, a sense of possibility. To the following morning, Elijah woke before dawn, his mind already racing with ideas that had crystallized during sleep. He reached for the notebook Professor Maxwell had given him and began to write, filling pages with his circular diagrams and the equations that flowed from them. The Wheeler-Maxwell Paradox had been just the beginning. Once he'd broken through that conceptual barrier, other possibilities began to emerge. Applications of his circular permutation theory to problems in quantum computing, in black hole information theory, in the mysterious behavior of entangled in particles. By the time Ms. Rivera called everyone for breakfast, he had filled 12 pages with dense notation. He carefully tucked the notebook into his backpack alongside his worn school supplies and headed downstairs. Horizon House mornings were organized chaos. 12 children ranging from 6 to 16, all trying to eat, prepare for school, find missing shoes, and homework assignments. Ms. Rivera and the morning shift assistant Daryl moved through, the tumult with practiced efficiency, making sure everyone had what they needed. "Elijah, did you finish your history essay?" Ms. Rivera asked as she poured cereal for one of the younger children. He nodded, mouth full of toast. "And you've got your inhaler?" Another nod. The familiar rhythm of morning questions grounded him, a counterpoint to the whirlwind of new ideas in his mind. "Professor Maxwell called this morning," she said, lowering her voice slightly. "He's arranged for a driver to pick you up from school at 3:30. I've already spoken to the principal. They know you have permission to leave early." Elijah's hand stilled momentarily. It was really happening. "You nervous?" Marco asked from across the table, always perceptive despite his jovial nature. "A little," Elijah admitted. Marco grinned. "Don't be. You're the smartest person in this whole city. That professor is lucky to have you." He reached over and stole the last piece of Elijah's toast, a familiar gesture of brotherly affection. "Just don't forget us little people when you're winning Nobel Prizes." The local public high school, where Elijah attended classes, was a stark contrast to the gleaming facilities of Stanford University. The buildings were utilitarian, the resources limited, the teachers overworked, but dedicated. Elijah moved through his morning classes with his usual quiet focus, though his mind frequently drifted to the afternoon ahead. His physics teacher, Mr. Gonzalez, caught him after class. "Elijah, I got a call from Stanford this morning. Professor Maxwell? The surprise and pride in his voice were evident. He said you solved something called the Wheeler-Maxwell Paradox. I had to look it up. That's beyond impressive. Elijah shifted uncomfortably under the praise. It just made sense to me. Mr. Gonzalez shook his head in wonder. I always knew you were working far beyond our curriculum, but this is extraordinary. He clasped Elijah's shoulder. I'm proud of you, and if you need anything, time off for this mentorship, help catching up on regular classwork, just let me know. Thank you, Elijah said quietly, unused to such attention from teachers who typically had too many students and too little time to notice his self-directed studies. The rest of the school day passed in a blur. When the final bell rang at 3:15, Elijah made his way to the front of the school, where a university car was already waiting. The driver, a graduate student named Priya, greeted him warmly. Professor Maxwell has been talking about you all day, she said as they pulled away from the school. The whole department is buzzing. It's not every day someone solves a 30-year-old paradox, especially not a high school student. Elijah gazed out the window as they drove toward Palo Alto, watching as the neighborhoods gradually changed, becoming more affluent as they approached the university. The contrast between his daily surroundings and the privileged world of Stanford had never felt so stark. When they arrived at the physics building, Professor Maxwell was waiting outside, pacing with barely contained energy. His face lit up when he saw Elijah. There he is, Maxwell called, hurrying over as Elijah stepped from the car. Thank you, Priya. Elijah, come with me. There are some people I want you to meet. He led Elijah not to the lecture hall from yesterday, but to a smaller conference room on the 4th floor. Inside, a group of people sat around an oval table. Dr. Hernandez and Dr. Choi from the previous day, plus 3 others Elijah didn't recognize. On the whiteboard at the front of the room were his circular diagrams, meticulously recreated from yesterday's work. Everyone, this is Elijah Foster, Maxwell announced as they entered. Elijah, you know Dr. Hernandez and Dr. Choi already. Allow me to introduce Dr. Zhang from quantum computing, Dr. Williams from theoretical physics, and Dr. Patil from the applied physics laboratory. The professors nodded in greeting, studying Elijah with undisguised curiosity. He felt a flutter of anxiety in his chest, the same feeling he experienced whenever too many eyes were on him at once. We've been discussing your solution all morning, Maxwell continued, guiding Elijah to an empty chair. Dr. Patil has already identified a potential application in his work on quantum entanglement. Dr. Patil, a serious-looking man with rectangular glasses, leaned forward. Your circular permutation model suggests a new way to visualize entangled states. I'd like to test some simulations based on your equations, if you're amenable. Before Elijah could respond, Dr. Williams chimed in, and the implications for information theory are significant. If energy states truly cycle in the way your model suggests, it changes our understanding of entropy in closed systems. The conversation rapidly accelerated, the professors building on each other's observations, proposing applications and extensions of Elijah's work. Terms flew across the table: Hilbert spaces, eigenvalues, topological quantum field theory, some familiar to Elijah from his self-study, others entirely new. Maxwell noticed Elijah's growing discomfort. Perhaps we're getting ahead of ourselves, he said, gently interrupting the enthusiastic discussion. Elijah, did you bring your notebooks, as I asked? Elijah nodded, reaching into his backpack to pull out 3 worn composition books filled with his work from the past several years. He hesitated before handing them over. These are personal, he said softly. Not just physics. Maxwell nodded in understanding. We'll respect that boundary. We're interested in your scientific insights, not your private thoughts. Elijah surrendered the notebooks. The professors handled them with care, passing them around the table, expressions shifting from curiosity to astonishment as they paged through years of independent work. "This is remarkable," Dr. Zhang murmured, pointing to a page filled with diagrams. "This resembles a quantum circuit design, but using your circular approach instead of traditional gates. Have you tested this mathematically?" Elijah nodded. "It's more efficient for certain operations. Reduces decoherence by almost 40% in theory." Dr. Zhang looked up sharply. 40%? That would be revolutionary for quantum computing stability. "And here," Dr. Hernandez said, pointing to another page, "this appears to be an extension of your approach to cosmological models. You're suggesting that certain properties of black holes could be modeled using the same circular permutation theory." "It's just a theory," Elijah said quietly. "I don't have the mathematical tools to fully develop it yet." Maxwell closed the notebook he'd been examining. "That, Elijah, is precisely why we're here, to provide those tools to help you develop these insights." He turned to his colleagues. "I think we've seen enough to confirm what I suspected. Elijah's work deserves serious attention and support." The group discussed next steps, a specialized curriculum, regular mentoring sessions, access to computational resources that Elijah had never dreamed of having. Through it all, he remained quiet, both overwhelmed and exhilarated by the sudden validation of ideas that had lived only in his mind and his tattered notebooks. As the meeting concluded, the professors filed out, each pausing to shake Elijah's hand, not with condescension, but with genuine respect. Dr. Hernandez was the last to leave. "Elijah," she said, "when I was 10 years old, my teacher told my parents I wasn't mathematically inclined. By 18, I had taught myself calculus from borrowed books, but no one saw that potential in me until much later." She smiled warmly. "What I'm saying is, I understand what it's like to have ideas that outpace your circumstances, and I'm very glad you're here now." When only Elijah and Maxwell remained, the professor sat down beside him. "How are you feeling? I know this is a lot to take in." Elijah stared at his notebooks, now stacked neatly on the table. "It doesn't feel real," he admitted. "Yesterday I was just Elijah from Horizon House, the weird kid who likes math too much." Maxwell chuckled. "And today you're still Elijah from Horizon House, but also a young scientist whose work has 5 Stanford professors reconsidering their research directions." He paused. "Your circumstances don't define your potential, Elijah. They never did." "My parents would have been proud," Elijah said softly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Maxwell's expression softened. "Tell me about them, if you don't mind." Elijah rarely spoke about his parents, but something about the professor's gentle interest made it easier. "My father was an engineer. Not famous or anything, just at a local firm. He built bridges, real ones, not theoretical ones." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He used to say that engineering was physics with dirt under its fingernails. "A practical man," Maxwell nodded. "My mother taught music at an elementary school. Piano mostly. She's the one who first showed me that mathematics and music were connected, harmonic ratios, frequency patterns." His voice grew quieter. "She used to play Bach while I did homework. Said the mathematical structure would help me think clearly." "And she was right," Maxwell said. "Bach's compositions have remarkable mathematical properties. Some music theorists even suggest that his work anticipates certain aspects of modern pattern theory." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the late afternoon sun slanting through the windows of the conference room, casting long shadows across the table. "Elijah," Maxwell said finally, "I want to show you something." He stood and gestured for Elijah to follow him down the hallway to his office, Unlike the orderly conference room, Professor Maxwell's office was a cheerful chaos of books, papers, and scientific equipment. One entire wall was covered with whiteboards, filled with equations. Another featured framed photographs spanning decades. Maxwell as a young man, standing before particle accelerators, shaking hands with famous scientists, accepting awards. But it was what sat on his desk that drew Elijah's attention. A small wooden box, intricately carved with circular patterns that bore an uncanny resemblance to Elijah's own diagrams. Maxwell noticed his gaze. "Beautiful, isn't it? A gift from a Tibetan monk I met while lecturing in Dharamsala 30 years ago." He picked up the box and handed it to Elijah. He called it a mandala box, said it represented the circular nature of existence. "When I saw your diagrams yesterday, I was reminded of it immediately." Elijah turned the box in his hands, tracing the carved patterns with his fingertips. "It's like what I see in my mind when I think about energy states," he said softly. "Exactly," Maxwell nodded. "Which makes me wonder if what you've discovered isn't entirely new, but rather a forgotten way of seeing, one that exists in contemplative traditions, in art, in music. Perhaps you found a mathematical language for something humans have intuited for centuries." Elijah looked up, surprised by this philosophical turn. "I thought science was about finding new things, not rediscovering old ones." Maxwell smiled. "The best science often does both." Einstein's work had echoes of ancient philosophical questions about the nature of time. Darwin's evolution reflected ideas about interconnection that existed in many indigenous worldviews. He gestured to the box in Elijah's hands. "Great insights rarely emerge from nothing. They're often new expressions of persistent patterns in human understanding." As Elijah carefully placed the box back on the desk, Maxwell checked his watch. "It's getting late. You should get back to Horizon House for dinner. But before you go, I have something for you." He opened a drawer and pulled out a small device. A secure tablet. It has access to scientific journals, research databases, simulation software, tools you haven't had before. Consider it yours for the duration of our work together. Elijah accepted the tablet with wide eyes. "Thank you, Professor." "Richard," he corrected gently, "and you're welcome. Now, Priya, we'll drive you home. Tomorrow we begin the real work." As Elijah turned to leave, Maxwell called after him. "Oh, and Elijah, I've arranged for a proper watering system to be installed in the Horizon House garden. Automated, but still following your circular design. I hope that meets with your approval." Elijah stared at him in surprise. "You remembered about the watering schedule." Maxwell's eyes crinkled with warmth. "Of course. Genius takes many forms, caring for others, designing garden systems, solving impossible physics problems. They're all connected in their way." On the drive back to Horizon House, Elijah held the tablet carefully in his lap, still processing the events of the past 24 hours. The impossible had become possible, and the circles that had once been his private sanctuary were now being studied by some of the finest scientific minds in the world. As the car pulled up to the familiar yellow Victorian, he saw Mia sitting on the front steps, small face pinched with concentration as she worked on what was likely her dreaded math homework. The sight grounded him, reminding him that even as one world opened up, another continued its steady rhythm. "Same time tomorrow?" Priya asked as he gathered his things. Elijah nodded, then stepped out into the fading light of evening, moving between worlds with a new sense of purpose. 6 weeks passed in a whirlwind of discovery. What had begun as twice-weekly meetings between Elijah and Professor Maxwell quickly expanded into an intensive mentorship program, unlike anything Stanford had implemented before. The university's administration, initially hesitant about working with a 16-year-old from outside their traditional academic pipeline, had been swayed by the growing evidence that Elijah Foster's circular permutation theory represented a genuine breakthrough. The conference room in the physics building had been converted into a dedicated workspace for their collaboration. Whiteboards covered every wall, filled with equations and diagrams that evolved daily as Elijah's ideas developed under Maxwell's guidance. A powerful computer workstation had been installed for running simulations of Elijah's theories, and a small sofa added for the inevitable late afternoons when the work continued beyond Elijah's scheduled return to Horizon House. Today, the room was particularly crowded. Dr. Hernandez was perched on a stool near the main whiteboard, while Dr. Choi and Dr. Zhang sat at the conference table reviewing printouts of recent simulation results. Two doctoral students whom Maxwell had invited to join the project were huddled over a laptop in the corner, debating the code for their latest model. And at the center of it all, Elijah stood beside Professor Maxwell, explaining his latest insight. The traditional approach treats quantum entanglement as a binary relationship, Elijah said, drawing two interconnected circles on the board. But if we model it using nested circular permutations instead, we can see how multiple quantum systems might form coordinated networks without direct entanglement between each node. Maxwell studied the diagram, his expression thoughtful. Like a quantum version of 6 degrees of separation, not every particle directly connected, but information still flowing through the entire system. Exactly, Elijah nodded, his confidence having grown significantly over the past weeks. And if that's true, it explains the anomalies in the quantum computing simulations Dr. Zhang has been running. Dr. Zhang looked up from his papers. The coherence duration exceeded our predictions by a factor of 3 in the last test. If your model is correct, we could maintain quantum states long enough for practical computation without the need for extreme cooling systems. The implications hung in the air, a path to quantum computers that could operate at room temperature, dramatically expanding their potential applications and accessibility. It's still theoretical, Elijah cautioned, a humble habit that had endeared him to the team. Even as his ideas reshaped their understanding of quantum physics, he maintained the perspective that everything remained provisional until proven by experiment. Dr. Hernandez crossed the room to examine the diagram more closely. We need to test this experimentally. The quantum lab at Berkeley has the equipment we'd need, and Dr. Okonkwo owes me a favor. Maxwell glanced at his watch. That's a discussion for another day. It's nearly 5:30, and Elijah needs to get back to Horizon House. He turned to Elijah with a softer expression. Ms. Rivera called earlier. She mentioned something about a group home inspection tomorrow. Said you were needed to help prepare. Elijah nodded, already gathering his notebooks. The rhythm of his dual life had become familiar. Mornings at high school where he moved through standard classes with increasing detachment. Afternoons at Stanford where his mind was fully engaged. Evenings at Horizon House where his heart remained anchored. I've arranged for Priya to drive you, Maxwell continued. But before you go, I wanted to discuss the conference. Elijah paused in his packing. Conference? The International Symposium on Quantum Physics at MIT next month, Maxwell explained. The committee has invited us to present your work. It would be a significant platform. The leading researchers in our field will be there. The room fell silent, all eyes on Elijah. Despite his growing comfort with the research team, the prospect of presenting to hundreds of physicists from around the world sent a jolt of anxiety through him. Would I have to speak? He asked, his voice smaller than it had been during the confident explanation of his theory moments earlier. Maxwell understood the source of his hesitation. I could present the mathematical framework, and you could join me for the technical questions afterward. We'd prepare thoroughly, of course. Elijah focused on organizing his papers. buying time. To process this unexpected development, I'd need to get permission from Ms. Rivera and the state caseworker. I've already spoken with Ms. Rivera preliminarily, Maxwell assured him. She's supportive, provided we arrange appropriate chaperoning and accommodations. The university would cover all expenses. The prospect was both terrifying and exhilarating. Elijah had never traveled by airplane, had never left California. MIT was a mythical place in his mind, a name from the spines of textbooks and the bylines of research papers he'd struggled to access before the tablet Maxwell had given him opened those doors. "Think about it," Maxwell said gently, seeing Elijah's overwhelm. "We can discuss it more tomorrow." The drive back to Horizon House was quiet, Elijah staring out the window as the sleek university buildings gave way to more modest neighborhoods. His mind was not on the conference, however, but on something that had been troubling him for weeks, the growing distance between his two worlds. At high school, teachers had begun treating him differently since word of his work at Stanford had spread. Some were overly deferential, others skeptical or resentful of the special accommodations he now received. His few friends had drifted away, unsure how to relate to him. Meanwhile at Stanford, despite the team's acceptance, he was still an anomaly. Too young to join the graduate students for drinks after work sessions, too advanced to be treated as merely a promising student. Only at Horizon House did he still feel fully himself, neither prodigy nor orphan, just Elijah who helped. With dinner and fixed the perpetually jammed laundry room door and read stories to Mia. But even there, things were changing. The younger children now looked at him with a kind of awe, especially since a local newspaper had published a profile titled "From Group Home to Stanford, the Remarkable Mind of Elijah Foster." As the car pulled into the driveway of Horizon House, Elijah spotted an unfamiliar black sedan parked in front. When he entered the house, the reason for the visitor became immediately clear. Standing in the living room with Ms. Rivera was a woman in a sleek pantsuit, her posture radiating authority. "Elijah," Ms. Rivera called, an unusual tension in her voice. "This is Ms. Diane Lowell from the Harrington Foundation. She'd like to speak with you." The woman turned, offering a professionally warm smile and an extended hand. "Mr. Foster, it's a pleasure to meet you. Your work with Professor Maxwell has attracted considerable attention." Elijah shook her hand cautiously. "Thank you." "The Harrington Foundation specializes in supporting exceptional young talents," she continued, "particularly those from non-traditional backgrounds. We'd like to discuss the possibility of becoming your educational sponsor." Ms. Rivera cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should all sit down. I've prepared some tea." Once they were settled, in the modest living room, children's artwork on the walls, furniture worn but clean, Ms. Lowell opened her leather portfolio. "Our foundation was established to identify and nurture extraordinary potential that might otherwise go undeveloped due to economic or social circumstances. We currently sponsor 38 young people worldwide. Musicians, mathematicians, scientists, artists." She looked directly at Elijah. "What you've accomplished with the Wheeler-Maxwell Paradox and your subsequent work on quantum entanglement models is precisely the kind of breakthrough thinking we exist to support. What exactly would this sponsorship entail?" Ms. Rivera asked, her protective instincts evident. "Full academic financial support through undergraduate and graduate education. Housing in one of our residential facilities designed specifically for gifted young scholars. Access to advanced mentorship beyond what even Stanford can provide." She turned to Elijah. "You would have your own apartment, state-of-the-art computing resources, and colleagues at your intellectual level." The offer hung in the air, gleaming with possibility. No more crowded group home, no more stretched resources, no more dividing. His attention between high school classes that bored him and the research that energized him Where is this facility? Ms. Rivera asked. Our main campus is in Boston, adjacent to MIT and Harvard. We also have smaller satellite locations near other elite universities, including Stanford. However, given the particular focus of Elijah's work, we believe the Boston campus would be most appropriate. Boston, across the country, away from Horizon House, away from Ms. Rivera, away from the younger children who had become the closest thing to family he had left. It's a significant decision, Ms. Lowell acknowledged, but one that could dramatically accelerate Elijah's development. Our program would eliminate the administrative hurdles he currently faces as a ward of the state, provide stability through his transition to adulthood, and connect him with the very best minds in theoretical physics globally. And what does the Harrington Foundation get in return? Ms. Rivera asked, her tone carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp. Ms. Lowell smiled slightly. A fair question. We ask only for acknowledgement in published papers and the opportunity for our other scholars to learn from Elijah's insights through occasional seminars. We take no ownership of intellectual property and impose no research directives. She closed her portfolio. Our founder, James Harrington, was himself a child of the foster system who later became a successful entrepreneur. This foundation is his way of creating opportunities he wishes he'd had. Ms. Rivera turned to Elijah, who had been unusually quiet. What are your thoughts? Elijah looked down at his hands. Could I think about it, and maybe speak with Professor Maxwell first? Of course, Ms. Lowell said smoothly, handing him a business card. Take whatever time you need. I'll be in the area for the rest of the week. She stood to leave. One more thing. The foundation also arranges for appropriate legal status. In cases like yours, we typically work with the state to establish educational guardianship until you turn 18. After she had gone, Ms. Rivera sat beside Elijah on the couch. That's quite an opportunity, she said softly. It would mean leaving, Elijah said, still looking at his hands. Yes, she acknowledged, but perhaps it's the right next step. You've already outgrown what the local schools can offer you. What about Mia's homework and Marco's college applications and the garden? Ms. Rivera placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. We managed before you came to us, Elijah. We'll manage again if you need to go. Her voice was steady, but there was a sadness in it that Elijah had rarely heard. The question isn't whether we need you, it's whether this opportunity is what you need. That night, Elijah sat on his narrow bed in the small room he shared with Marco, the business card from the Harrington Foundation on his desk, beside Maxwell's leather notebook. Marco was downstairs helping the younger boys with their evening routine, giving Elijah a rare moment of solitude. Boston, a real apartment, not a shared room in a group home. Resources beyond anything he currently had access to. Other young people who might understand what it was like to see the world through eyes that perceived patterns and connections others missed. But Boston also meant leaving behind everything and everyone familiar. It meant trading the hard-won stability of Horizon House for another new beginning. It meant trusting strangers who spoke of opportunity and potential, but knew nothing of his nightmares, his fears, his need for the circular structures that had kept him from falling apart after losing his parents. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Mia stood there in pajamas printed with stars, her dark hair in messy braids, clutching a math workbook. Ms. Rivera said not to bother you, she said solemnly. But fractions are stupid and they hate me. And despite his churning thoughts, Elijah smiled. Fractions don't have feelings, Mia. She crossed her arms defiantly. Mine do, and they're mean. He patted the edge of the bed. Come on then, let's talk to these unfriendly fractions. As he patiently guided her through equivalent fractions and common denominators, using the visual circles he had developed years ago to help her see the patterns, Elijah felt a clarity settling over him. The decision about the Harrington Foundation wasn't just about physics or opportunity or resources. It was about where and how he could best become the person he wanted to be. Not just a physicist, but a whole human being. The next morning, Elijah called Professor Maxwell before school. "Can we talk about something important today?" he asked. "It's not about the conference." "Of course," Maxwell replied, concern evident in his voice. "Is everything all right?" "Just complicated. Someone from a foundation came to Horizon House yesterday. They want to sponsor me, move me to Boston." There was a pause on the line. "The Harrington Foundation?" "Yes," Elijah said, surprised. "Do you know them?" "They've approached some of my colleagues about students before. They do excellent work." Another pause. "We'll discuss it this afternoon." School passed in a blur, Elijah's mind too preoccupied for even the pretense of attention. When he arrived at Stanford, he found Maxwell alone in their workspace, the usual team conspicuously absent. "I thought we might need privacy," Maxwell explained, gesturing Elijah to a seat. "Tell me about the Harrington Foundation's offer." Elijah outlined the proposal: the financial support, the housing, the mentorship, the legal guardianship. Maxwell listened attentively, asking occasional questions, but offering no opinion. "What do you think I should do?" Elijah finally asked. Maxwell sighed, removing his glasses to polish them, a habit Elijah had come to recognize as a sign he was carefully choosing his words. "As your scientific mentor, I should tell you to accept immediately. The Harrington Foundation's resources exceed what Stanford can provide, particularly for someone in your unique situation. Their Boston campus would put you at the center of one of the world's great scientific communities." He replaced his glasses. "But as someone who cares about you beyond your mathematical gifts, I need to ask, what do you want, Elijah?" The directness of the question caught Elijah off guard. So much of his life had been determined by circumstances beyond his control. His parents' death, his placement in foster care, the limitations of his schooling. Even his work with Maxwell had begun almost accidentally, a result of his curiosity, rather than deliberate choice. "I want to keep developing the circular permutation theory," he said slowly. "I want to see if it can help solve real problems in quantum computing, in understanding fundamental particles, maybe even in black hole information theory. And personally," Maxwell prompted gently, "beyond the science." Elijah looked down at his hands. "I want..." He paused, struggling to articulate feelings he rarely examined. "I want somewhere I belong. People who understand both parts of me, the physics and the rest of me, the part that still misses my parents, the part that needs to help Mia with fractions and make sure the herbs get enough water." Maxwell nodded thoughtfully. The Harrington Foundation excels at developing scientific minds. Their track record is impressive, but their model separates exceptionally gifted young people from typical environments, creating a kind of specialized hothouse for talent. "Is that bad?" Elijah asked. "Not inherently. For some young people, it's exactly what they need." Maxwell leaned forward. "The question is whether it's what you need. You've thrived in our hybrid approach these past weeks, keeping your connections at Horizon House while stretching intellectually here. Your empathy, your groundedness, those qualities inform your scientific thinking in ways that are deeply valuable." Elijah considered this. "The Foundation representative said Boston would be better for my work. Perhaps in terms of pure resources. But science doesn't happen in isolation from life, Elijah. Your circular permutation theory didn't emerge from textbooks. It came from your experience, from the ways you found to make sense of loss and change. That connection to real human experience gives your work a dimension that purely academic approaches often lack. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision palpable between them. "There is another option," Maxwell said finally. "One I've been considering for several weeks, but hadn't yet raised because it seemed premature. Perhaps now is the right time." Elijah looked up, questioning. "My wife, Evelyn, and I have no children," Maxwell said carefully. "Our home is larger. Then we need a historic Victorian in faculty housing with a garden that could benefit from your expertise." He paused. "We could apply to become your foster parents. You would live with us, continue your work here at Stanford, maintain your connections at Horizon House, and avoid the disruption of relocating across the country." Elijah stared at him, speechless. "It would be complicated legally," Maxwell acknowledged, "but not impossible. Evelyn is on the university's legal team. She's already looked into the process. The state does allow for educational foster placements in special circumstances." "You want me to live with you?" Elijah asked, his voice barely audible. Maxwell smiled gently. "Evelyn has been asking to meet you for weeks. She's quite impressed by what I've told her about your work and about you as a person. The idea of providing a home for you. It would be our privilege, Elijah." The unexpected offer left Elijah momentarily overwhelmed. He had prepared himself for discussing Boston, for weighing the Harrington Foundation's proposal against his current situation. But this third option, remaining in California, continuing at Stanford, but with a stable home environment specifically supportive of his work, it hadn't occurred to him as a possibility. "What about the conference at MIT?" he asked, his mind latching onto a concrete detail while the larger implications processed. "We would still attend, regardless of where you live," Maxwell assured him. "Though, if you were living with us, the permission process would be simplified." Elijah nodded slowly, thoughts racing. "Could I think about it? Talk to Ms. Rivera?" "Of course," Maxwell said. "This isn't a decision to rush. And if you prefer the Foundation's offer, or even remaining at Horizon House while continuing our work together, Evelyn and I will support whatever choice you make." As their meeting concluded, Maxwell walked Elijah to the waiting car. Before he climbed in, Maxwell placed a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever you decide, remember this. Your value isn't just in your mathematical abilities, it's in the unique perspective you bring, shaped by everything you've experienced. The circular patterns you see, the connections others miss, they matter. To science, yes, but they're also part of what makes you who you are." Elijah nodded, a lump in his throat preventing speech. As the car pulled away, his mind was awash with possibilities he had never imagined when he had slipped into that lecture hall 6 weeks ago and raised his hand to offer a solution to an impossible problem. That evening, after dinner was cleared and the younger children were occupied with homework, Elijah asked Ms. Rivera to walk with him in the garden. The late summer evening was warm, the concentric beds he had designed years ago lush with vegetables and herbs. They sat on the bench in the center, where he had first heard Maxwell's proposal for mentorship weeks earlier. "Professor Maxwell has offered to become my foster parent," he said without preamble. "He and his wife. I'd live with them, near Stanford." Ms. Rivera's eyebrows rose, but she didn't seem entirely surprised. "That's a significant offer. How do you feel about it?" "Confused," Elijah admitted. "The Harrington Foundation would give me amazing opportunities. But Boston is so far, and I'd be with strangers. Living with Professor Maxwell would let me stay. Here, keep working at Stanford, still visit Horizon House, but it's still another change, another new home." Ms. Rivera was quiet for a moment, looking out at the garden. "When you first came to us, Elijah, you wouldn't speak for weeks. You drew circles on every surface, notebooks, fogged windows, even traced them on your plate at dinner." Her voice was soft with memory. "I knew then that you had a mind that worked differently, that saw patterns others didn't. What I didn't know was how much that perspective would matter to the world. She turned to face him. Our job here isn't to keep you, it's to help you find your path forward. If that path leads to the Maxwell's home, or to the Harrington Foundation, or even to staying here until you're 18, what matters is that it's right for you. How do I know what's right? Elijah asked, the question hanging vulnerable in the warm evening air. Ms. Rivera smiled. Draw it in circles. Map it out the way you do everything else that matters. Where do you see yourself completing the loop? Later that night, Elijah sat cross-legged on his bed, Maxwell's leather notebook open before him. In it, he began to draw. Not equations this time, but circles representing the paths his life could take. Horizon House in the center, then branching outward. Stanford with the Maxwells, Boston with the Harrington Foundation, each with smaller circles for the implications, the gains, the losses. As the diagrams grew more complex, a pattern began to emerge. Not a perfect solution, but a path that felt most aligned with who he was and who he wanted to become. When he finally closed the notebook, the first hints of dawn were lightening the sky outside his window, but his mind was clear. The next day, he would make his decision. The MIT conference hall buzzed with anticipation. Hundreds of physicists from around the world filled the auditorium, programs open to the page, highlighting the day's most anticipated presentation. Circular permutation theory, a new framework for quantum entanglement by Professor Richard Maxwell and Elijah Foster. In the green room, Elijah adjusted his tie nervously. 3 months had passed since he'd made his decision. 3 months of intense preparation, groundbreaking simulations, and profound change. The navy blue suit he wore had been a gift from Evelyn Maxwell, tailored to fit his slender frame. The leather notebook Professor Maxwell had given him sat on the table beside his presentation notes, worn now from constant use, its pages filled with the evolution of his theories. Ready? Professor Maxwell asked, straightening his own tie. Elijah took a deep breath. I think so. Remember, just as we practiced, Maxwell said. I'll introduce the mathematical foundation, and you'll explain the applications to quantum computing. He placed a reassuring hand on Elijah's shoulder. They're here to learn, not to judge. But they both knew judgment was inevitable. The audience included Nobel laureates, department chairs from prestigious universities, representatives from major technology companies developing quantum computers, and even officials from government research agencies. News of the breakthrough had spread rapidly through the physics community, generating both excitement and skepticism. A 16-year-old orphan with no formal training, claiming to have solved what leading minds had declared impossible. Many had come specifically to witness what they expected would be a humbling failure. The stage manager appeared at the door. 5 minutes, Professor Maxwell. As they gathered their materials, Maxwell studied Elijah with evident pride. However this goes, I want you to know something. In 40 years of teaching, I've never been more certain that I was witnessing the beginning of something extraordinary. Elijah felt a flush of gratitude. The past 3 months had transformed his life in ways he could never have imagined when he first slipped into that Stanford lecture hall. He had moved into the Maxwell's Victorian home in faculty housing, his few belongings from Horizon House now installed in a sunlit bedroom with a desk overlooking Evelyn Maxwell's garden, which he had already begun redesigning with concentric beds. The legal process had been complex but swift, expedited by Evelyn's expertise and the state's recognition of exceptional circumstances. Ms. Rivera had supported the transition wholeheartedly, though not without tears when he packed his things. To his relief, the Maxwells had encouraged his regular visits to Horizon House, understanding that those connections remained vital to his sense of self and stability. Most importantly, his work had flourished under Maxwell's guidance and the resources now available to him. The circular permutation theory had expanded beyond its initial application to the Wheeler-Maxwell Paradox, spawning new approaches to quantum entanglement that had attracted attention throughout the physics community. What had begun as a lonely boy's way of containing grief through patterns had evolved into a framework with profound implications for quantum computing, information theory, and potentially even cosmology. "One last thing," Maxwell said, reaching into his briefcase. He withdrew a small box and handed it to Elijah. "A tradition in my family. My father gave me this before my first major presentation." Elijah opened the box to find a simple silver tie clip engraved with a circular pattern. "It seemed fitting," Maxwell said with a gentle smile, "a circle for the boy who sees in circles." Elijah's throat tightened as he carefully attached the clip to his tie. Such small gestures of belonging had been rare in his life since losing his parents. The Maxwells never tried to replace them. They respected his grief too much for that, but they had created space for him to be both the brilliant young physicist and the orphaned boy, still learning to navigate the world. The stage manager reappeared. "We're ready for you." Maxwell nodded to Elijah. "Let's change some minds." They walked onto the stage together, greeted by polite applause. The bright lights momentarily disoriented Elijah, but he found his place at the side of the podium as Maxwell stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate respect. "For 30 years," he began, "I presented my students with what we called an impossible problem. The Wheeler-Maxwell Paradox became a teaching tool meant to illustrate the limitations of our current understanding of quantum thermodynamics." He paused, scanning the audience. 3 months ago, a 16-year-old boy with no formal training in advanced physics showed me how wrong I was. A murmur rippled through the auditorium. In the front row, Elijah could see Dr. Zhang from Stanford, who had flown in to support them. Beside him sat Dr. Hernandez, her expression encouraging. Even Ms. Rivera was there, having flown in yesterday with special permission from the state, seated further back with Evelyn Maxwell. "Today," Maxwell continued, "we present not just a solution to that paradox, but a framework that may fundamentally alter how we conceptualize quantum interactions. Before I introduce my young colleague, I want to address the skepticism many of you brought with you today." Maxwell removed his glasses, a gesture Elijah had come to recognize as a sign he was speaking from the heart rather than from prepared notes. "Science progresses not when we confirm what we already believe, but when we encounter ideas that challenge our most fundamental assumptions. Throughout history, breakthrough insights have often come from unexpected sources, from patent clerks thinking about riding beams of light, from amateur astronomers noticing patterns professionals overlooked, from mathematicians working in isolation from academic orthodoxy." He replaced his glasses. "I give you Elijah Foster, co-developer of circular permutation theory." Elijah approached the podium, heart pounding. The sea of attentive faces, Nobel laureates, department chairs, research directors, momentarily overwhelmed him. Then he took a deep breath and focused on the mathematics, on the circles that had guided him since childhood. "Traditional models of quantum entanglement use linear representations of particle relationships," he began, his voice steadier than he had expected. "But when we map these relationships as circular permutations instead, new patterns emerge." The presentation had been rehearsed dozens of times over the past weeks. In the Maxwell's living room, in the Stanford Physics Department conference room, even once via video conference with Dr. Okonkwo at Berkeley, whose quantum lab had begun preliminary experimental tests of the theory. But standing before the leading minds in quantum physics, Elijah found himself deviating slightly from the script, responding to the energy in the room. The key insight isn't mathematical complexity, he explained, drawing elegant circular diagrams. On the digital display, it's conceptual simplicity. Energy doesn't just flow linearly from point A to point B. It cycles, returns, permutates through states in patterns that are better represented as circles than as lines. As he spoke, the initial skepticism in the audience began to shift. Elijah could see it in their body language. Physicists leaning forward, furiously taking notes, occasionally glancing at colleagues with expressions of dawning recognition. This approach resolves the Wheeler-Maxwell Paradox by reconceptualizing the boundary conditions, he continued, gaining confidence. Instead of forcing energy states into linear models that create apparent contradictions, we allow them to follow their natural circular pathways. For 40 minutes, Elijah guided the audience through the theory, from its mathematical foundations to its practical applications. When he displayed the results of their latest simulations, a 45% increase in quantum coherence duration using their model, the room fell silent. In that moment of quiet, Dr. Yoshida, a distinguished physicist from Tokyo University, known for his ruthless critiques of new theories, slowly rose to his feet. Elijah braced himself for the first challenging question. Instead, Dr. Yoshida began to applaud. Others followed until the entire auditorium stood in ovation. Maxwell joined Elijah at the podium, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder as the applause continued. "Ready for questions?" he asked quietly. Elijah nodded, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. This validation, not just of his theory, but of his very approach to understanding the universe, was beyond anything he had allowed himself to imagine. The question session was rigorous but respectful. Dr. Yoshida asked about potential applications to quantum gravity theory. A researcher from IBM's quantum computing division wanted details about implementing the circular model in physical quantum bit architectures. A cosmologist from Princeton inquired about implications for black hole information theory. Through it all, Elijah answered with growing confidence, occasionally deferring to Maxwell, but increasingly standing on the strength of his own understanding. The circular notation system he had developed, once just a private language for containing his grief and making sense of chaos, was now being adopted right before his eyes by leading scientists seeking to communicate complex quantum relationships. When the formal presentation concluded, they were surrounded by colleagues eager to continue the discussion. Business cards were pressed into Elijah's hands, invitations extended to visit laboratories, requests made for advance copies of their next paper. Among the crowd was Dr. Eleanor Harrington, founder of the Harrington Foundation, who had flown in specifically for the presentation. "Mr. Foster," she said, extending her hand, "your work exceeds even our highest expectations. While I admit I was disappointed by your decision to decline our sponsorship, I can see now that you made the right choice for your development." She glanced at Maxwell with professional acknowledgement. Sometimes the right mentorship matters more than even the best resources. "Thank you," Elijah said, thinking of the circular diagram he had drawn that night in his bed at Horizon House, the one that had led him to choose Maxwell's offer over the Foundation's. "I think it was about finding the right balance between growth and stability." Dr. Harrington smiled. "Wisdom beyond your years. The Foundation would still welcome your participation in our summer intensive programs, should you be interested. A chance to collaborate with other exceptional young minds without uprooting your life." "I'd like that," Elijah said, surprised to find himself meaning it. The prospect of meeting others who might understand his unique way of seeing the world held new appeal, now that he no longer feared losing the connections that grounded him. As the crowd gradually dispersed, Elijah found himself approached by a man in his early 30s, wearing a Silicon Valley casual suit that stood out among the academic attire. "Elijah Foster," Thomas Reed, Quantum Horizons. He handed Elijah a sleek business card. We're a startup developing practical quantum computing applications. Your circular permutation model could be exactly what we've been looking for to solve our coherence issues. Maxwell, who had been speaking with colleagues nearby, smoothly inserted himself into the conversation. Mr. Reed, a pleasure. I'm Richard Maxwell, Elijah's mentor and guardian. The man's smile didn't waver. Professor Maxwell, of course. An honor. I was just telling Elijah that our company would be very interested in licensing the circular permutation algorithm for commercial applications. Any such discussions would need to go through Stanford's Technology Transfer Office, Maxwell said politely, but firmly. And of course, would require careful consideration of Elijah's academic priorities and well-being. Reed nodded. Absolutely. We'd be happy to discuss appropriate arrangements that support his continued research while allowing the wider world to benefit from this breakthrough. He turned back to Elijah. The practical applications of your work could transform everything, from medical imaging to financial modeling. We'd love to have you visit our labs sometime. After he departed, Maxwell gave Elijah a knowing look. The first of many such approaches, I suspect. Your work has commercial implications that extend far beyond pure theoretical physics. Is that good? Elijah asked, still processing the interaction. It's complicated, Maxwell said honestly. The boundary between academic research and commercial application has always been fraught, but we'll navigate it together. Evelyn is particularly skilled in these matters. The mention of his wife brought a smile to Maxwell's face as he spotted her making her way through the crowd with Ms. Rivera. Both women reached them at the same time, enveloping Elijah in congratulatory embraces. You were magnificent, Evelyn said, her normal professional reserve melting into genuine pride. The corporate attorney had initially seemed intimidating to Elijah with her precise speech and formal demeanor, but he had quickly discovered her warm heart beneath the polished exterior. She had transformed his bedroom with thoughtful touches, a state-of-the-art desk lamp, bookshelves custom-built to accommodate his growing collection of physics texts, even plants arranged in concentric circles on his windowsill. Ms. Rivera held him at arm's length, examining him with the keen eye of someone who had watched him grow through some of his most difficult years. Look at you, she said softly. Addressing a room full of the world's smartest people like you were born to it. I was terrified, Elijah admitted. Courage isn't about not being afraid, she reminded him, an echo of conversations they'd had many times at Horizon House. It's about doing what matters, even when you're scared. A text message alert chimed on Elijah's phone. It was from Marco. Mia got an A on her fractions test. Says to tell you your circles worked. We're all watching. The live stream. You're blowing our minds, bro. Attached was a photo of the Horizon House children gathered around a computer, all giving thumbs up. In the center sat Mia, beaming and holding up a math test with a red A circled at the top. Elijah smiled, showing the message to the others. The smaller circles still matter too. Always will, Maxwell agreed. That's what makes your perspective so valuable, Elijah. You see both, the cosmic patterns and the human ones. As the auditorium gradually emptied, a young graduate student approached hesitantly. Mr. Foster, I was wondering... She held out a copy of the paper they had published outlining the initial theory. Would you sign this? Your work is the reason I've redirected my research focus. Elijah accepted the paper with surprise. Really? She nodded earnestly. The way you visualize quantum relationships, it's changed how I see everything. I was struggling with traditional approaches, but your circular models make intuitive sense to me. She hesitated, then added more quietly, I'm also from the Forster system, seeing you up there today, it meant something to kids like us. As he signed the paper, Elijah felt something settle within him, a recognition that the patterns that had once been his private sanctuary now formed a bridge to others. His circles, born from loss and nurtured in unlikely circumstances, had completed their journey from personal necessity to shared understanding. The post-presentation reception was held in an elegant room overlooking the Charles River. Academics mingled with industry representatives, all eager to continue discussing the implications of the circular permutation theory. Elijah found himself the center of attention, answering questions and explaining concepts with growing ease. During a rare, quiet moment, he slipped away to the balcony for a breath of fresh air. The Boston skyline glittered against the darkening sky, a constellation of human ingenuity reflected in the river below. He thought about how far he had come from the silent, grief-stricken boy who had arrived at Horizon House 4 years ago, drawing circles on every available surface to contain a world that seemed to be spiraling out of control. He was joined on the balcony by Dr. Zhang, who offered him a glass of sparkling water. "I have a confession to make," the quantum computing specialist said. "When Richard first showed me your solution, I was certain it was his own work that he was attributing to you, a kindness to encourage a promising young mind, perhaps." He looked out at the river. "I have never been so pleased to be proven wrong." Elijah sipped his water. Professor Maxwell could have claimed it himself. Most people would have believed him, not me. Dr. Zhang nodded thoughtfully. That is what makes him not just a great scientist, but a great man. He recognized something extraordinary and chose to nurture it rather than exploit it. He turned to face Elijah directly. "Your circular approach has influenced my own work profoundly. I've begun reimagining quantum algorithms using your permutation framework, and the results are promising." Inside, the reception continued, but Elijah lingered on the balcony a moment longer, watching the lights reflected in the water. Each point of light joined to others in his mind, forming patterns, loops, interconnected systems. The universe revealed itself in such moments, order emerging from apparent randomness, beauty arising from underlying mathematics. Maxwell found him there. "Everything all right?" Elijah nodded. "Just thinking." "About what comes next?" "About how circles always return to where they began, but never quite the same way." Elijah gestured toward the city lights. "I used to draw circles to make the chaos make sense. Now other people are using my circles for the same reason." Maxwell leaned on the balcony rail beside him. "That's the true impact of great science. It gives us language for things we've sensed but couldn't articulate. Your circles have become a new dialect in the language of physics." When they returned inside, Evelyn approached with news. "The department chair at MIT has invited us to dinner. Apparently there's interest in establishing a joint research initiative between Stanford and MIT based on Elijah's work." The evening continued with such surprises. Interest from the National Science Foundation in funding expanded research, an invitation to give a similar presentation at CERN, requests for collaboration from quantum computing companies. Through it all, Elijah maintained a quiet centeredness, neither overwhelmed by the attention nor dismissive of its significance. Later that night, back in their hotel suite, the Maxwells and Ms. Rivera celebrated more privately with cake Evelyn had arranged. From a local bakery, the frosting was decorated with concentric circles in varying colors. "A toast," Maxwell said, raising a glass of champagne while Elijah held up his sparkling cider. "To circles that expand rather than close, to questions that lead to better questions, and to a young man who reminds us that the most profound insights often come from the most unexpected sources." Ms. Rivera added her own toast, "and to found family in all its forms." After she had returned to her own room and the Maxwells had retired, Elijah sat by the window of his hotel room, the lights of Boston spread out below. He opened his notebook, the one Maxwell had given him on that first day, and began to sketch. Not equations this time, but a simple set of concentric circles. In the innermost circle, he wrote, Mom and Dad. Around that, Horizon House, Ms. Rivera, Marco, Mia. In the next, Maxwell, Evelyn. The outer circles expanded to include his growing scientific community, Dr. Hernandez, Dr. Zhang, the researchers at MIT and beyond. Circles within circles, each connected to the others, none replacing what came before, but all adding to the whole. He had once drawn circles to contain loss. Now he drew them to map connection. As he closed the notebook, his phone chimed with one last message for the night. It was from Professor Maxwell. Breakfast at 8. Dr. Okonkwo's lab just reported preliminary, experimental confirmation of the coherence predictions. Your theory is becoming reality. Proud doesn't begin to cover it. Elijah smiled and set the phone aside. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new applications, new directions for his work. But for tonight, he simply sat with the quiet satisfaction of having followed his circles exactly where they needed to lead. In the silence of his room, he whispered words he hadn't spoken aloud in years. I wish you could see this, Mom and Dad. And somewhere in the patterns of the universe, perhaps they did. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.